conifer management is one of the tools. It's one of the activities that we need to look at. So we thought we'd give you kind of an update on where we're at and have the panel discuss maybe where it is we should be going. So there we go. So basically I'm going to start just by talking about the efforts to date. Why remove conifers? I know this is pretty basic for most of us, but there's probably some folks out here that might be a little unsure about why we do this. But basically it's because Gunnison sage grouse do not like trees. And they'll tend to avoid a tree line from about 300 feet, as Cam said today, and those areas that are greater than 4% tree cover. So the treatments that we're looking at are basically designed to maintain or reestablish the sagebrush. And it's really popular right now. You look, there's been a lot of literature, there's been a lot of work, particularly under SGI, doing conifer removal. And the reason for that is it quickly restores habitat. As a habitat person, I'm always trying to put something back into the system. Cool seasons, we need more forbs, we need more sagebrush. Whereas with conifer removal, you're taking something off the table and actually doing good. So it's a good tool. It's relatively inexpensive in most cases. It requires minimal NEPA, and the NEPA being the cultural clearances, a lot of the things that, because the disturbance is less often, it has low to moderate impacts in your sagebrush, so you're not having to really destroy your sagebrush to fix it, if you will. And the only downside to it is there's generally maintenance involved with this. Depending upon the technique and the prescription, you're often looking at going back in and doing a re-entry, getting those trees again, in 10 or 15 years. So there's basically 3 ways you can approach taking these trees out: roller chopping, hand thinning, and mastication. And they all have their pros and cons. Basically, roller chopping is probably the most destructive, if you will, and is generally utilized when you're looking at what is basically a climax pinyon juniper community, and you're trying to revert that back to sagebrush. This is a tool you would use. It's basically, you can see it down here in the lower left. It's a bulldozer that is towing a weighted drum behind it that has paddles. It knocks the trees over, cuts them up into chunks. Hand thinning is great because it's more targeted, and it's low disturbance. You can get out there and walk around and not really be messing things up. The only problem is it's slower, and you have to deal on smaller scales. And then you always have an issue of slash disposal. When you go out here and start cutting these trees, and they're generally cut in lengths of a couple feet, and the trunks, same thing. But when you start chopping down a good-sized tree and leaving it in a pile, slash becomes an issue that you have to deal with. And finally, there's mastication, and it's definitely cleaner when you see a mechanically treated area where it's been chipped. You just have this nice, neat mulch out there. It's very clean. The problem with this is that it can be very expensive, up into the $300 an acre range. So this is a typical area here that we looked at. This happens to be in Dry Creek Basin. It's called the Dry Wild Project. And this is what we started with in 2009. It's a mixed Parks and Wildlife and Bureau of Land Management administered area. So we started in, and this is what we wound up with. So this is 2009, and this was about 2015. This took a whole series of projects over a long period of time, and it was a great cooperative effort to do this. But what you can see, the difference there in cleaning that up is fairly substantial. So this was a mechanical treatment. We had Hydroaxis come in and do this work. Then we came in behind that. There were some actual, when we were done, we had these little circles of trees. They were cultural areas that we had to avoid. But then we came back in on top of those and took the trees out with chainsaws and hand crews. So where have we been doing this? Within the occupied range of Gunnison sage grouse, the Gunnison Basin basically does not have a conifer problem, at least compared to other places. I know that there may be some places in Gunnison that conifer removal might help, but It's a much larger issue at Pinyon Mesa, at Crawford, Sims Mesa, and in the San Miguel Basin. There's definitely probably some work that could be done in the Monticello area, but I couldn't make contact with anyone there about getting some data on the projects that have been done. So I'm really going to focus on these 4 places. So starting with Pinyon Mesa, if you're familiar with that, the core range of that, if I got our little pointer here. The core range is right here. And it's higher elevation. It's mountain sage blending into snowberry. And down below, you start getting into the pinyon juniper. But the core range is up here. And the projects that have been done, if you'll notice, there's about 3,500 acres. This is in the occupied. If you come over here, you can see that there's been about 40 projects done. And that includes the potential and vacant unknown habitats, primarily Glade Park area. A lot of them are roller chops. And 42 maintenance projects had to be undertaken, and that's primarily because you started with a roller chop. You're almost inevitably going to have a maintenance project have to follow it. In this case, I also included Dominguez. This is the highway coming down through to Gateway. On the other side of Uinta Canyon, you're actually on the Uncompahgre Plateau. There's an old lek here that was counted back in the 60s. It disappeared a long time ago. But within this occupied habitat, the Forest Service has also been doing some treatments in there, and there's about 2,200 acres that have been done. Come on. So an example of the work that's been done up there at Pinyon Mesa, this is actually called Timber Ridge. And this has been worked over pretty heavily. It was chained. It was a Climax Pinyon Juniper community that was chained in the 60s. They followed up with a roller chop treatment in the early 2000s. And finally, they did a hand removal, I think in 2014, right, Dan? So this has actually created really habitat, I think. This isn't just kind of trying to preserve a sage park. This is getting pretty radical and doing a type conversion. In the San Miguel Basin, there's been about 14,000 acres of work done in the San Miguel Basin. Primarily, this has been done in Dry Creek Basin. Oops. Sorry. This is the dry wild treatment. There's been treatments on the state wildlife area and all this area that's been out to the west that Nate's been working on for a number of years now. There's also been a lot of work done down here. This is Miramonte. And there's not really a pinyon problem here, but there is a Rocky Mountain juniper issue. So even though you're talking about, often talking about PJ, sometimes what you're really dealing with are junipers in the higher elevations. But there's been a lot of work done here, about 4,000 acres where we've taken the trees out. Most of them were really thin. The projects went really quickly, but it took those trees out. And this is the West Highway project. This is in Dry Creek Basin as well. This is one that Nate did, I think, a year or two ago. But what we're trying to do is to move, kind of create more habitat back in here. This is all sagebrush to the south. And what we're doing is kind of extending this range up into some of these areas. And I don't know, it would be an interesting research project, but it seems like in these areas that have intermixed conifer, you have better understory. I don't know why, but you tend to have more cool seasons, more forbs in those areas. So taking these trees out, as we did over here, really does open up some better habitat. As far as the Sims, Cerro, and Crawford, Sims Mesa down here, south of Montrose, that area is BLM primarily, but there's a big chunk of private right in the middle of it. And you can kind of see where some of that has been. That private's right here, and this is BLM and BLM. But we've done over 500 acres on Sims Mesa to restore that sagebrush habitat. There's been some projects, little ones over here at Cerro Cimarron, and I didn't have information on those, but I'm sure they're less than probably 500 acres. And then jumping over to Crawford, there's been a lot of work done at Crawford. Some of the databases I pulled up, the DLT, some of the other project files I had. There's projects on top of projects on top of projects there. So basically I ended up just drawing a big circle around it and saying, you know what, we got about 4,000 acres worth of treatments in here. In the interim, I think we need to think about what was done. Plow and seeding is a lot more brutal to the whole landscape than, say, just the hand thinning. So I think it's a good rough number to throw out there, but I think we probably need to refine that if we're really looking at a detailed analysis. And this is a typical area. This is on north of the county road there, where they just took out, and the trees are pretty substantially thick in there. This was probably a mastication, I'm guessing, rather than a hand thin. So the perceived effectiveness, basically the ultimate answer always is, are we doing any good here? We're spending some money. We've taken out 24,000 acres of trees. Are we doing any good? And some of the issues with that are the low numbers. We do not have good numbers as far as grouse to monitor and track and do a real science study on this. So we're kind of left with anecdotal sort of evidence as to whether or not we're being effective. And there's also the issue of the remaining birds. They're not necessarily habitat limited. It's like if you've got a house that's only half full and you've got 3 bedrooms that are empty, is building more bedrooms on that house really going to benefit you? So there's that issue. And then finally, we have to understand that as I kind of run through this, basically, if it weren't for transplants, we have really very little idea whether or not we're doing any good here. So it's basically the utilization by transplants, and that does skew your data because those transplants, they tend to range further. They're looking for a home, and they're a lot more open to moving into some of these areas once they've been cleared. So going back to Pinyon Mesa and the Timber Ridge project, grouse were transplanted in 2010 to Pinyon Mesa, but they were put up high. The birds were later tracked to Timber Ridge in the winter. Basically, they spent the summer up high in the spring, summer, and then they ended up down there on Timber Ridge during the winter of 2011. Then lekking activity was observed in 2012, and they actually used this treatment area as a release site later in 2013. So I think you could say it was fairly successful. In the Crawford area, a lot of the treatments that were done there predate any collar information. And where we do have collar information, it does seem like the birds were almost immediately utilizing the treated areas. They'd be in there within a matter of a month or so, and this was some of the satellite data with the translocated birds. So again, you look at the treatment, you look where the collar locations are, and they're certainly not shying away from these areas. And then finally, there's the San Miguel Basin, going back to that dry wild treatment. We did have collar data going back to 1995, some of Clayton Braun's work actually. But what happened then was that the birds basically stayed east of Dry Creek, and they moved on up into the triangle area in the basin and onto the west. They totally avoided this area in here almost. I think we have one location there that was on the other side of the creek. So in 2014, when we did transplants out there, those birds were actually released in this treatment area, and they stayed there. They moved, they explored out in here some, but this remained the core of the utilization area for those transplants. They had every opportunity to come back into this country and just didn't seem to want to. It's kind of weird that you have that line. But I would say based on that certainly we created some habitat there. Whether or not the birds persist, that's a different question. But I think I feel pretty good about what we did there in dry wild. So if you're just looking at is this a good thing or not, there's a lot of issues that need to be considered. Number one is conifer invasion really an issue for your population? And that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be decided, I think. Also consider the quality of the sagebrush. If, as in this picture right here, if this is your understory, taking the trees out of that is probably not going to help you any. If you got dirt and sage, you're still going to have dirt and sage. So I think you need to consider that as you're looking at projects. Obviously, the size and density of the trees and the size of the treatment area. And the connectivity. Are you creating that sea, or are you just creating another little island somewhere? So the goal of this should really be connecting habitats, not necessarily creating new isolated ones. And finally, as we discussed this morning, what's the cost benefit if this is going to negatively impact other species? Mule deer, I do a lot of conifer removal for mule deer, but it looks vastly different than conifer removal for sage grouse. Sage grouse, you just need to take every tree. It's all got to go. But for deer, you want to create that mosaic. And actually, the mosaics and the habitat, the pictures that Amy was showing you today, is kind of what I'm shooting for when I'm doing a conifer project for mule deer. So some of the projects I've done on private land was not good for the deer. I'll be upfront with you. This picture was actually taken on private landowner's property where we were taking out those trees. So that's certainly something to consider. And Dan pulled this together. There's a lot of literature. We're kind of coming into this assuming that conifer removal is a good thing, but there is a lot of literature backing this up that we're creating habitat and we're doing good things for grouse. And I would say that a lot of this has been done in the Great Basin, in Wyoming, and in greater habitat, with greater sage-grouse populations. And you need to keep that in mind because things are different with Gunnissons, particularly as you move down south. So, but this literature is a good place to start. And finally, I'd like to make a pitch for Marcella. She will, I don't know if she's here. Is she here? She's not here. Marcella is putting on a series of wildlife workshop or habitat workshops next summer in Hotchkiss, Gunnison, and Glade Park. And I'm slated to give at least an hour presentation specifically on prescriptions, and we'll get more down into the weeds, I think, on doing these treatments. I'm sure there's other questions specifically about how you treat and when you treat, but the conversation that we kind of really wanted to kick off with this was where does this fit as a priority? If we have all this banquet of options under the wrist to be doing these different activities, how do we prioritize? And we just wanted to have a conversation about, okay, conifer removal, where does this fit? Are we better off doing conservation easements? Are we better doing wet mesic meadow habitat? What is it that we need to be doing? And so we're at least going to have this little kind of niche discussion about where this fits into the future by population. So I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan Newbaum is a biologist. He's terrestrial biologist for Parks and Wildlife out of Grand Junction. And he's going to lead our panel discussion.
Thanks, Jim. We're going to run through a few questions with the panel members here first, just to get some population perspectives. And then after we get through those, we'll kick it back out to the audience for additional questions or thoughts. So our first panelist is Nate West, and I believe he is joining us virtually. Nate, did you have some slides that you wanted to show us first?
Yeah, it essentially was kind of what Jim showed. Just a lot of the treatments that we've done in Dry Creek Basin. Look, we've treated 6,740 acres since 2012 in the last 10 years. And one of the things that we started trying to do was just to keep costs down is we would masticate. We would just do class 3 cultural surveys on the areas we're going to masticate. And then generally around there, you have a lot of the phase 1 type of encroachment. We could do like a class 1 cultural survey. It's a lot faster. It's a whole lot cheaper. And we'll just lock and scatter in those areas. And so we've started focusing in the sagebrush and just kind of slowly moving out to the edges. And I mean, there's not really a lot of pinyon juniper work left to do in the basin. And so, yeah, right now we're kind of shifting our focus and moving more towards how do we improve upland brood ring habitat? Because, I mean, we're probably going to go to retreat at some point, but right now it kind of feels like, well, we've done a lot of the easy stuff, and now we just got to put a lot more thought into what we're going to do and where we're going to do it.
Great. Maybe I'll cover Pinyon Mesa next, and then we'll work through the populations, and then Brandon can give us a broader range-wide perspective. So for Pinyon Mesa, we're kind of in a similar boat that Nate just described, where there was a lot of work done early on after our conservation plan came out in about 2000. A lot of it was roller chop where they got a lot of acres done fast. But as Jim mentioned, there was a lot of follow-up maintenance because you get a lot of saplings or trees that weren't totally killed. And so they eventually grow back up and you got to go back in and clean all those up periodically. So there's been pros and cons there to that work that was done on Pinyon Mesa. The other aspect of it is that we have had some success, and Jim showed that Timber Ridge area where we did have transplanted birds moved there. They were marked birds. The cool additional thing in that scenario is that there were unmarked birds that were noted or cited with those transplanted birds. So whether or not they had already been there and led the transplants there or vice versa, we don't really know that. But we were getting use by both transplant and local birds that were unmarked. But outside of that example, a lot of our other locations that were more in kind of potential habitat, we have not necessarily seen them get used. We did do a large effort to go back into a lot of those treated areas and look at them in terms of how they matched up to the range-wide guidelines for habitat. And we did find that they were meeting those guidelines at about 10 or 15 years out. So that was encouraging. In theory, at least, the habitat was looking like what we were hoping for. So that's kind of what we've experienced on Pinyon Mesa. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've slowed down a lot in our conifer work. A lot of the low-hanging fruit is done, and now we're kind of looking for specific cases that help with connectivity and that might need to be maintenanced again. So, Neil, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Neil Perry. I'm out of the Montrose Sun Compadre Field Office. And we manage both the Simsero population and the Crawford population. Simsero, as Kathy pointed out during her talk yesterday, hasn't had birds detected at it in well over 10 years at this point. So it's kind of lower priority in the grander scheme of our field office. It's a very small, isolated population too. But nonetheless, we worked with Jim in recent years to take advantage of some funding that we had to improve that habitat. And that population, that area has been identified in the RIS as a location where we are tasked with improving habitat quality there. That's a sage system that does lack a lot of the herbaceous diversity that we would hope for in any sage system. So there's a lot of merit to doing work in that area, and we'll continue to kind of seek opportunities to improve that herbaceous understory and the diversity of habitat or diversity of plant species that are missing from that population. Crawford is the location where we have remnant birds, but although, as Kathy pointed out, pretty rapid decline and very few left. That place has been, as we often say, loved to death. It's been treated on top of treatment on top of treatment in a lot of places. And most of the efforts in recent years have been focused on just trying to kind of seek and destroy the last few remnant conifer plants that we can find. There are tiny little patches that got missed somehow through all those treatments. And so we've put a good bit of effort into kind of cleaning that up, so to speak. And then we're transitioning into largely just a maintenance phase there from a conifer perspective. Just getting really small, almost entirely just those early phase tiny plants out of there, including even like some volunteer projects where we just give them a bunch of loppers and people can go out and move early on. That's the cheapest, easiest way to maintain some of these habitat areas. But like Jim mentioned, some of the issues we have there probably moving forward have more to do with that late brood rearing habitat, cover, sage cover in general out there is an issue. So we're really kind of moving in that direction, and just as far as conifers go, just into maintenance phases.
Hello, I'm Brandon Miller, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and within the service, I'm under the Refuges program, specifically the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, and we're focused on private lands habitat projects. And I'm based here in Gunnison, but I cover basically all the Gunnison sage grouse range, actually all of Southwest Colorado with various species priorities. But as far as pinyon juniper work goes on private land, it tends to be somewhat opportunistic. You know, I think Seth Gallagher might have coined the phrase contagious conservation. At least I borrowed it from him. He might have got it from somewhere else. But, you know, we tend to, you know, have some wins with landowners, that kind of thing. And then the other landowners looking over the fence and looking for what to do. But, and all these guys are my resources on the ground. I'm just one guy running around out here. And, you know, I just try and leverage projects with CPW. You know, BLM's doing a project or Forest Service doing a project. You know, I try and tap into like, hey, what's going on in that private boundary over there? You know, would they be interested in doing, you know, continuing that work in that direction? So right now there's, you know, I did some work with Marcella. It's been a great opportunity to leverage NRCS funding given the deep Farm Bill pockets there. We kind of consider our funding kind of seed money to leverage other projects. Right now I have a NIFWIF Restore grant focused on specifically on conifer removal and for the satellite populations. So looking for projects there. If anyone knows of any, happy to help. Yeah, right now I got one project happening in the Crawford population. It's kind of on the fringe, although it is within critical habitat. Another one on Pinyon Mesa, and another one working with Evan Phillips, Miramani. And yeah, I'm just always looking for new stuff. I don't have as a clear perspective on these individual populations as far as grouse movements, where the leks are. I just really kind of lean on partners for that kind of thing, but happy to help if those projects are out there.
Great. Nate, are you still with us? Okay.
We might have lost
Well, I did want to ask you guys also, kind of following up on some of what we heard this morning with concerns related to other species. As you move forward into the future with developing new projects, one, do you still see a lot of merit for this type of exercise or effort using conifer management removal? And if you do, are you concerned about other issues such as other species? And then also, is funding an issue for you?
I'm going to go reverse order. Funding's generally not a challenge for us at the BLM. We get a pretty good slug of money every year. And I find that if we feel strongly about a project, we can typically work it out either through our partners or through our internal funding. With regard to the other species of concern, that's obviously something we always think about throughout the process of developing projects. In these areas, in Crawford in general, and really throughout our field office, I should say, we do emphasize ecological site potential when considering projects. And I think that's kind of an important thing to remember for a lot of us when we're doing these projects. There's just some areas where the soil nature, the nature of the soil depth, sort of prohibits the reestablishment of the types of herbaceous understory or sagebrush canopy that we might be trying to achieve for sage grouse. So it's important to kind of know what you're working with fundamentally from the bottom up and what that site potential is to be restored to a sage park, which is typically for sage grouse what our objective is. I find in these places where we're working with sage grouse, usually it's pretty uniform with regard to the potential to have a healthy sagebrush ecosystem. And as a consequence, if we're managing that site and we've achieved our conifer removal objectives, that benefits a very large suite of sage-dependent species. In places where it gets to be a little bit more complicated, I do think we need to be careful of that, where we're not targeting pinyon juniper trees in an unnatural or inappropriate way. And just in my experience, you can usually see the results on the ground or lack thereof if you're removing pinyon juniper trees from inappropriate places. And I find that in our landscape, the topography kind of drives a lot of that. So it's almost hard to do it wrong. Now, I know some people probably argue with me on that one, but if you're considering ecological site potential and take into consideration a lot of stuff that Jim mentioned before, if you go to a site that's just sage and dirt, you might not be benefiting very much. You might want to be considering more aggressive or complicated restoration measures that are going to restore that herbaceous diversity. But that is very challenging. And in general, when we're doing conifer removal, we are targeting places that have that potential already there and are recently, so to speak, invaded. I hate to use that term personally, by pinyon juniper trees, because it's a natural process for them to come in. In essence, when we're doing these treatments, I would argue we're very much trying to simulate a disturbance regime that we have largely as humans through fire suppression for the last 100 years, removed from a lot of these landscapes. So it's not wholly unnatural, I'd argue, to remove them, but again, calling them invasive is a little unfair, I think. Did I miss some portion of that question? I feel like I probably did. No. Okay. Oh, I over-answered that question.
Yeah, he said it all for me. Actually, can you repeat the question? Sure. Yeah, I mean, funding for us, we honestly, for Gunnison sage grouse, it's sometimes tough to get the money in the bank for some of this stuff, but it's usually there, and we can find a way to get to it. We've had issues, actually, Dan and I recently, where there were more funders than there was work, and so we're all fighting for who can spend the most money. And I think the nature of that is private lands where you don't always have, private landowners running through the door, why I'm like, hey, I'm with the government, I'm here to help kind of thing. But, we just try and build those relationships and find a way to work in these types of treatments or other treatments with these private landowners that are in a way that are going to be a win-win on private land for grazing operations and wildlife. I was surprised to see Amy's presentation. I saw a lot of pictured trees that I would have cut down in that, and I felt bad. But yeah, but that really makes me think. That we need more input. I need more input on some of these projects. Is this gonna? Are we filling the one side of the sink just to let it drain out the other? I don't have all the answers. I mean, I try and leverage resources from every perspective on projects, and a lot of that's got to be, technical kind of expertise on some of these, other species that I'm not always thinking about because we're so, myopically focused on sage grouse and, other species. And I think I can do a better job. And that's why, things like the summit, it's been great for me to learn a lot of this stuff and apply that down the road. And Amy, you might be getting a call from me on some of this stuff. So.
I'm going to add real quick. We do have other projects where coincidentally, somehow I've got a real penchant for picking projects and locations that pinyon jays also exist. And so Amy's been very gracious to actually go out in the field, talk about some of these issues. Those are mule deer specific projects, though. I'm not sure that pinyon jays and sage grouse are necessarily going to have that level of overlap in general. Pinyon jays, from what I've learned from Amy, are typically established or in places that have well-established conifers, where sage grouse are going to be ignoring them. But I do think it's really important that we take advantage of all these resources. We're lucky to have somebody like Amy, all these folks around, and everybody seems happy constantly to go out in the field and talk about these issues about different species. We all need to be vigilant, and it's honestly not something I would have thought about a couple of years ago, but I feel good about where we're going now with regard to conifer removal and the potential to benefit a whole suite of species. So thanks, Amy.
Yeah, I would reiterate those same concerns on Pinyon Mesa, where we definitely have areas where we are working out on the edges trying to push habitat out. And as a result, those are some of the same places that are likely to have some of these species that we're worried about. But I think that we can shift gears a little bit and change our practices and get out and pre-survey some of those areas and maybe eliminate some of those concerns by doing that and still do good work. And the other nice thing is that the critical timing of the overlap between pinyon jays and Gunnison sage grouse seem to overlap a little bit, where we're not going to be in there in the spring or early summer doing treatment work anyways because of our sage grouse restrictions. So that is helpful in some ways. In terms of the funding, like Brandon mentioned, we have had periods where you may have no funding at all when you really need it, and then you'll turn around and get a bunch of funding, but you have somebody back out of a project and all of a sudden you can't spend it within the limited time period that you have the money for, and you don't want to look bad because you didn't spend the money, but you're stuck in these weird situations. So funding can be a challenge where it's all or nothing. And Jim, I don't know if you want to add to that question as well, since you do a lot of that.
Yeah, right now we don't have a lot of dedicated internal funding for Gunnison sage grouse. It's we've been relying a lot on BLM assistance money here the last couple of years, but it sounds like there's a lot of money coming towards the feds and possibly towards us as well. So I'm not really worried about the money right now. I think I'm more worried about good quality projects. The problem with too much money is it tends to breed poor planning and poor execution and poor choice of places to do the work. So I think if I'm not worried about money or getting money, I'm more worried about us having both the time and the personnel to really do the planning that should go with these. Like I say, you're going to probably benefit sage grouse by doing this, but if you were at the same time creating adverse impacts to other species, you've got trade-offs there. I don't know how important it is to say, you know what, I'm going to mess up 100 acres of pinyon jay habitat, but I'm helping Gunnison sage grouse. Is that enough to walk away and feel good about yourself? I don't know. Those are conversations that probably should be had, as working groups, as land managers, to have everybody sitting in the room and talking about that. So I think that's kind of where we need to go and push towards that. I know I'll try to speak for Nate real quickly here with regards to the San Miguel Basin. I think I agree with Nate. We've got most of the low-hanging fruit. The projects that we've got, there were clearly places where the trees have come in. I've got aerial photography that goes back to the 50s, and it would blow your mind to see how many trees have come in the last 70 years. So I feel comfortable saying I'm restoring a sagebrush park at that point. I think once we start looking at these Climax pinyon juniper communities, we need to think long and hard about going in there and trying to take those out, because number one, they're expensive to treat, and number two, you're going to be maintaining them for the rest forever, because they really are, Mother Nature is pushing them that way. So I think that's an important consideration. I know in the higher elevations, because once you leave Dry Creek Basin, you're really talking about the Maramani, Gurley, Beaver Mesa, Iron Springs Mesa. Those are all up there around 8,000 feet. And you don't have the same issue. I know Beaver Mesa has some conifer issues on it, and this might be a topic for Brandon about trying to convince a landowner to kill all the trees. It's not an easy sell to the ones that I've dealt with, for sure. They like their trees. They need them for the other wildlife. They're very cognizant, particularly big game, the hunting. So I don't see a lot of opportunity in these places, but you just never know. I wouldn't close the door on doing more conifer work in the San Miguel Basin. But honestly, I think we probably got higher priorities. We've got almost a complete lack of mesic habitat in places like Dry Creek Basin. It represents 60,000 acres of roughly 100,000 acres of occupied habitat. And we don't have any good mesic summer brood habitat in that area. And honestly, I don't know how those grouse survived as long as they did there. But it's something that we need to look at. And as Nate alluded, I think those understories where we have dirt and sage, or where we have warm season grasses and no cool season nesting cover, I think those are probably priorities from a habitat standpoint. But if you want to keep pushing it up a level, is habitat manipulation or habitat improvement that important? Should we be out there getting conservation easements on some of this private land? There's just other things. The Corps of Control, I think, do we have an issue with that in the San Miguel Basin? I think we do. So again, even pushing that further, I guess, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like we're looking at conifer management as being a pretty low priority, even though if you look up north, look at the SGI, it's all about taking out the trees. I think it's different, certainly in the Gunnison range.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Jim there. When we look back to the prioritized list of things to deal with for Pinyon Mesa in the initial conservation plan, removing conifer was number 1 or number 2 at that time, along with easements. And now that we're 20 years out, when we revisited all those and went through and re-ranked them again, that had changed dramatically, and conifer management had dropped to like 4th or 5th. So it's changed a lot for Pinyon Mesa.
Yeah, I just add job well done. I think it's done. We're in maintenance
Declare
phase.
victory, go home.
There's not much left to be done. It's worth maintaining, but there's bigger issues.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, but
I guess with that, we could turn this session over to you all and see if there's questions that you have about conifer management that you want to ask, or whether or not you have other suggestions that you want to add to the conversation at this time.
We have a question from a couple people on Zoom. They're both in regards to prescribed fire. So has anyone considered prescribed fire for conifer control?
I would say definitely not for Pinyon Mesa. Every time a fire starts up there, it has generally been pretty bad. And that's why we're kind of doing these treatments instead.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer succinctly. There's some places where prescribed fire might be appropriate, but in my experience in general, as somebody's presentation pointed out yesterday, sagebrush does not do well with fire. And given the challenge with invasive weeds, I'm not saying it would be off the table, but it'd be a very difficult treatment to consider, for me to consider anyways at this point in a place with such critically low numbers of sage grouse.
yeah, the fires I tend to see move through pinyon juniper. If there's a lot of juniper, you end up with a lot of juniper skeletons. So then you got to go in and treat those, and then you have no sagebrush understory. I've seen that scenario play out, and yeah, the invasive weeds issue is huge with that. I am interested with the Timber Ridge project, Jim. You mentioned that was more of an isolated type thing in a denser stand of juniper. Maybe something in that scenario where you're, working in like the phase 3 over, if you want to set back succession, and that's gonna, potentially if that, there's obviously risks and liability, but if that's a more an inexpensive way to treat that, really dense, higher elevation stuff. And I don't know, maybe chaining is cheaper and a better way to go, but I'm not sure. It's more of a question than an answer.
Thanks. Oh, well. No, I'm glad to hear you guys say that we won the war. Yeah, I think it's pretty well over. It's concerning when Mike Ned and some of our other directors of some of these federal land agencies are saying, let's treat 1 million acres. I don't think there's a whole lot of foresight when they think about the entire West. We have a unique situation here in Colorado, and we have a lot of smart people in this room, but you go outside of that, and there's not a whole lot of fortitude. They want to chase money, they want to get acres done, and there's consequences to that. As far as maybe a solution for this could be a guidebook on best practices from what we've learned over the years. For instance, now that we've done so much of it and seen a lot of the successes, perhaps we can I don't know, I just think about guidelines as far as is there cheatgrass present? And you probably shouldn't do a project there. Do you have understory and sagebrush? Is this really the, kind of some of the things you guys are talking about? Yeah, Pinyon J, all those things. Are you working with an interdisciplinary team? Have you been challenged on this decision in some way? I think there should be probably a higher bar for these projects moving forward. I think they are good projects. There's a lot of validity to them, but even for sage grouse anymore, I find it hard to get rid of every tree or slick it off like we used to in the old days. So yeah, just to kind of perspective, I think there's an opportunity here for an interagency effort to have a guidebook on how these projects are perceived or completed in the future.
I guess just as a quick follow-up to that, I'll note that in general, the BLM and most of my counterparts that I know do refer to the Sagebrush Restoration Handbook. It's a very useful tool put together by the Forest Service and USGS and I don't know who else. But it's actually cited now in a lot of our planning documents as a requirement for us if we're going to apply some of these categorical exclusions. So I think that a lot of these concepts our awareness of them are improving dramatically. I'm probably one of the few people in this room who at one time contracted thousands of acres of ely chain with a couple of bulldozers in Utah long ago. And I was young and just doing what I was told. And I look back on the nature of how we planned some of those projects, and it was like, man. So it's heartening to see some of the modeling exercises. I think for some of us who've been doing it for a long time, maybe it's not that necessary, but for the people who are coming up in the agencies to be exposed to these concepts of quality over quantity, I think is really important. And I do think, I'll reiterate what you said, the whole concept of acreage as a metric of success is really problematic. So it makes most of us kind of get our hackles up. Not the right way to do it.
I guess one other component that I'll add into the conversation too is that treatment of oak brush often gets kind of lumped in with conifer management just because you're out there using some of the same tools. And I know on Pinyon Mesa, when we were radio tracking birds, we were finding some of our birds in some of this mature savanna oak. And obviously when you treat that stuff, it just comes back like a carpet of small oak brush really fast. So the lifespan of that treatment can be pretty short. And if the birds are relying on something like oak brush that shades an understory and in super dry years maybe is the only, grasses or forbs that aren't brittle out there, then it might be something you want to think about before you undertake that. And so I'll just throw that out and put that on the pile too, Kathy.
I was just going to go back to this idea of acres being your measure of success. How do you change that? Because I see that in so many different documents and policies. Where does the change come from?
The way I'm trying to change that, and a lot of us in our field office, I think is actually we have a really good ecologist and a good group of folks, is to try to achieve this multi-year approach. I mean, I think somebody made the comments in their presentation about how historically it was kind of a one and done effort in a lot of these sites. And it is very difficult with grazing management and permittees that have schedules that they have to hit to, that they have to achieve every year to find contexts where you can apply multi-year measures and have criteria of success that are based on actually achieving the habitat metrics you're striving for. That's hard to do. But when we tally our acres, we can do it multiple times in the same spot. So if we masticate a spot, for 1,000 acres or whatever, that's 1,000 acres. If we seed that same location, that's another 1,000 acres. If we focus herbicide treatments or other kind of supplements in that, where that overlaps, it doesn't matter. We can still accumulate those acres. So we are in our field office anyways, and hopefully it'll kind of help push a trend forward, trying to find those location and contexts where we can achieve more of an ecological restoration, targeting places that are old treatments that have yet to or maybe never achieved objectives that provide opportunities for us to cause very little harm ecologically because the site's largely already kind of been nuked, so to speak, and then try to restore that community and still achieve those acres. So it's about creatively channeling those funds in places that you can do the least amount of harm, I would argue. So.
We have another question online. Are there insects that can be used to control conifers?
Well, I'm looking at Jim.
Well, yeah, the Ips beetle. There's several juniper rusts. I think it's I guess I never really thought about it as a tool. I suppose you could use one, but it's one that you would have so little control over that I don't think I would ever try to introduce that. Insect infestations are a very important driver for your pinyon juniper systems. And next to fire, and maybe possibly more important than fire, I think you get insect invasion on a much more recurring cycle than you do fire. Fire tends to be catastrophic. And if you look at down south, say on the Uncompahgre Plateau or somewhere, it's generally a 350, 400 year event, and it just takes out everything. Whereas the bugs, I mean, we've seen bug cycles, historically, that have come in and thinned, and in some cases, these bugs will target the so-called invading small pinions into these parks. So I think it's a tool, but I don't think it's a tool that we can use. So I'm more inclined to just let Mother Nature take its course and kind of handle the bugs and the rusts and stuff.
Thank you, guys. This is a great conversation. I remember about a year ago when we were doing the pre-summit, the topic came up about what you just mentioned, Jim, about landowners sometimes really like trees, and so trying to convince them to want to do a treatment where you're removing trees can be difficult. And I know in the context of what you've been talking about with maybe there's a lot of the low-hanging fruit or even the substantial fruit has been taken care of. But I do remember a conversation a year ago when we were saying some of the strategic places might still be on some of the larger private lands. And it would be this idea of trying to develop that relationship with those landowners and having to do that work of convincing them that tree removal would be potentially valuable to improve sage-grouse habitat. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts or if any of that, those discussions have happened, but how would you convince a landowner like that to do a treatment?
I can say that we've had some landowners that were interested in a conifer removal treatment, but when we actually went to the land and looked at it and laid out the acreage that we felt like we needed to open up in order to make it usable by grouse, all of a sudden they realized how much we were talking about, and that's not what they were originally envisioning. They were envisioning plucking a few ones out of the middle of the small park and calling it good, and we're looking at like the whole plateau area instead. And so I guess remedying that, I'm not sure what the answer for that is. In order to make those areas really useful and worthwhile, like Jim was saying, sometimes we do have to make them a little bigger, and that's not what landowners are envisioning.
Just to add real quick on the, for the Crawford population anyways, and these guys understand that as well, that the scale of the properties adjacent to us that have the potential to contribute to sage-grouse habitat are so small that it's difficult to find. You'd have to find 20 landowners, I think, to make a difference. The potential is absolutely there, though, but I'm not sure how you achieve that. He knows.
He knows.
Some of the conversations I've had with landowners, they know obviously more than I do about their own land, but they'll talk about how there used to be a spring here that used to run, or there used to be, this area used to be wet. We used to have more moisture. We can grow more grass. And, and they know it themselves. It's like, well, since these junipers have come in, we're starting to lose our understory. We're starting to lose, that's forage. You're losing forage, you're losing water. And, what is it? So a minimum of something like 30 gallons per day per tree or something like that. One of the USGS guys agree with me out there. As far as how much water an individual tree uses, and that's kind of the selling point. And they tend to know that more than I do to begin with. But we have done projects where we've opened up areas and we've had springs recharged where they hadn't seen water in years. And I think that is a good selling point for sure.